What game? They played the last game here. This walk down these steps was taken by some of the greatest athletes who've ever performed. But that's all over now for this place. 55,000 seats have emptied out for the last time. And all this place has left is memories. But what memories? A baseball game that won't be forgotten, not as long as the game survives. The Sneakers football game. And a prize fight. Oh, they still argue about this one. This ground has seen it all. A lot of sports history is buried here, where they played almost every game except one. Polo, and yet they called it the Polo Grounds. This is a street in Harlem, 110th Street and Fifth Avenue. 75 years ago, this was the Polo Grounds, because they played polo here. And baseball. It was the first home of the New York Giants. This Polo Grounds was torn down in the name of progress. What you see now, this neighborhood, is progress, 75 years later. From here, the Giants moved to the banks of the Harlem River on a 7.5-acre site owned by Colonel James Coogan. The new Polo Grounds opened in 1891. Every one of its 15,000 seats filled, and the crowd overflowing to the field itself. As good as a box seat was a horse and carriage. Then came the horseless carriage. And it wasn't long before the Giants were being brought to work in a style which, to say the least, befitted their standard. After all, they were the champions of 1905. In the early years of this century, the Giants' domination of the National League was almost undisputed. And why not? They had the immortal Christy Mathewson, who pitched 3 shutouts against the Athletics in the 1905 series. And there was Mr. McGraw, John J. McGraw, the peerless manager who took over the Giants in 1902. He was called Little Napoleon, but even those who felt the sting of his discipline regarded him with respect. Like Frankie Frisch, the Fordham Flash.
It's been said that they often said, and every ball player knew it, you never turn your back on John J. McGraw. But I can recall one time, oh, I did it, and I regretted it. Later on, it happened in Cincinnati. We were having a little set two, and I turned my back and I jumped into the shower, and I guess I was the first guy that took a bath before the old gent was finished speaking, and he really let me have it. We got to St. Louis, and boom, I got it again. And we were going to it hot and heavy, and the old Flash jumped the ball club. And that was a long ride back home, all by my lonesome, jumping the Giants. And I've often said, did I do the right thing? Well, I knew I was going to be traded, and I was traded. But when I get down the line, I say he was a fair man and a great man to play for, Mr. John J. McGraw.
In 1908, the Giants battled the Cubs for the pennant in a clutch ball game. The score was tied in the bottom of the ninth. Fred Merkle was on first when a single rapped home what should have been the winning run. But he never touched second and was declared out on a force play. The run was disallowed, a replay ordered. The New York Times called it censurable stupidity. A great crowd came out for the replay. But the Chicago Cubs, led by that flawless infield combination, Tinker to Evers to Chance, were not to be denied. The Cubs won and needed a police escort to get out of the Polo Grounds. Riots were started and fires set by the Giant rooters. Those that cared anyway. And Fred Merkle, he was ever after to be known as Bonehead. 3 years later, in 1911, fire destroyed the Polo Grounds. And so the Polo Grounds was left for dead. For the first time, it was left for dead. For 2 months, while a new Polo Grounds was being built, the Giants played at this corner. Then the home of the Yankees, now the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. This was progress of another kind. 2 years later, the Yankees moved into the Polo Grounds and played there for 10 years. Babe Ruth's first fan club was established there. And it was at the Polo Grounds that the Babe hit his first New York home run as a Yankee and trotted the bases in a manner that was to become as familiar as Liberty Bonds. War was brewing in Europe in 1913, and our service academies, Army and Navy, took over the Polo Grounds for their private battles. Then came the war bond rallies, John Philip Sousa, the never-to-be-forgotten Enrico Caruso, and the talented and the beautiful Anna Case. They sold thousands of Liberty Bonds at the Polo Grounds. With 2 baseball teams sharing the Polo Grounds, the stadium saw its share of heroes. Ty Cobb, who held many of the headlines of that era, came to town with his Detroit Tigers. He was as fast with an autograph as he was with his spikes. Polo Grounds had its heroes, all right, and it had its tragedies, too. Ray Chapman of the Indians. It happened right here, a pitch delivered by Carl Mays, whose knuckles scraped the ground and a submarine delivery hit Chapman in the head. He died the next day. But baseball continued, and Mayor Highland was throwing out the first ball. The Old Timers' Day was inaugurated. Attended by the first commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Rogers Hornsby came to the Polo Grounds, and Frankie Frisch left it. McGraw was a hard man. What Frisch did for the Giants was plenty, but Mr. McGraw was a hard man to please.
And we speak of John J. McGraw. What a man, what a great man. And he taught me many things. And when I came right off the campus, and I came in here to play with John J. McGraw, I thought I studied languages at Fordham, but I was taught a new language, and it was a beauty. But then I think, and he, as I played second, before me, he had a second baseman, Larry Durl, who was a pinhead. I came with the Giants, and I was a good old German concrete head. So you just took it and you went through with it, and you got used to it. You got hardened to it. But later on, it sort of hit the old Flash when he had a couple of bad legs, and then we had a little trouble. And he would say, a collegian. Don't bring me another collegian. I've had enough of them. My God, I was only hitting about 340. I didn't know what to expect.
On September 15, 1923, the streets around the Polo Grounds began filling early. Mounted police were dying to control the thousands who wanted to buy their way in. "90,000 persons got in to see an event still regarded as perhaps the finest moment in boxing. All the great sports writers of the day, including Grant and Rice, were there. So were the cameramen. The bull of the Pampas, Louis Firpo, was fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world against Jack Dempsey.
Firpo was one of the greatest competitive fighters I ever fought. He was game, he was a good puncher, and the only thing he knew, when that bell rang, he came out after you.
In those days, they came to fight. Some boxing buffs still argue about how many times Firpo was floored in the first round. After 5 knockdowns, Firpo was still unimpressed. The 6th knockdown didn't even slow the bull from the Argentine. And the 7th, if anything, only made him angrier. Keep in mind, we're still in the first round, and Firpo has been knocked to the canvas 7 times. Dempsey's turn is coming up. Down and out. Out of the ring. He wants to see that once more.
The press threw me back in the ring, and if it hadn't been for that, I'm sure that I've never gotten back in the ring. So I've always been grateful to the press ever since.
The second time down in the second round, Firpo stayed there. He never got the crown, but he'd proven himself a champion. To this day, Dempsey has no clear recollection of what happened or what round it happened in.
When you speak of the Firpo fight, it reminds me of the Polo Grounds. Of course, that's fond memories, and about the only thing I remember about the fight that night was shaking hands with Firpo, and the next thing I knew, I came to at the end of the first round thinking I'd been knocked out. I asked my old manager, Jack Kearns, what round I was knocked out in. He said, you weren't knocked out, you just slipped. But I knew differently. Then I started boxing Firpo and finally got lucky and knocked him out, and I think it was the 3rd round. But it was a wild fight. Anybody's fight up to the time it was over.
By the mid-20s, another game, football, had established itself as a Polo Grounds crowd pleaser, whether it was professional or college. The distance between the lines remained the same, and the exploits of 22 men battling it out was recorded from Section 33, the press backs for early football there. When Newt Rockney brought his underdog Notre Dame team here in 1924 to meet the West Point Cadets, the late Grant and Rice was in Section 33. Notre Dame won 13-7. As Granny Rice watched this game, he immortalized the Irish backfield in prose. He wrote, "Outlined against a blue-gray October sky, the four horsemen rode again. In dramatic law, they are known as famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. These are only aliases. Their real names are Stuldrare, Miller, Layton, and Crowley. The four horsemen." Sleepy Jim Crowley remembers.
It happened just 40 years ago when we played, Notre Dame played the Army in this wonderful old Polo Grounds. And Granny Rice was sitting high up in the press box, looking down on the panorama below, and he rose to lyrical heights and named our backfield the Four Horsemen. We shall be eternally grateful to Granny Rice for that title, because for the four of us, it has opened up many doors during the past 40 years. It might be interesting to note that during that game, Rockney did not start the first-string backfield, and we weren't scouted as well in those days as they do today, so the Army was under the impression that they were playing against Notre Dame's first-string backfield. And it was interesting and amazing to look at the looks on their face when the first quarter ended and Rockney ushered in the Four Horsemen.
The professional football giants opened the Polo Grounds to the appearances of new heroes. Among them, the legendary Galloping Ghost from Illinois, number 77, Red Grange of the Chicago Bears. 70,000 persons, an unprecedented crowd for football in 1925, watched him trample the Giants almost single-handedly. The spectators that afternoon saw more of Grange than the Giant ball players. The Depression pushed sports out of the spotlight, but not the Polo Grounds. It fought back with charity games. For one of these in 1930, Notre Dame's Newt Rockney brought his all-stars against the football giants. It was Rockney's last coaching assignment. He died 3 months later in a plane crash. Rock's team lost, but the game fed a lot of hungry people. Mayor Jimmy Walker helped baseball throw off the doldrums of the early 30s. John J. McGraw ended his reign, and Bill Terry was named his successor. 2 years later, Mr. McGraw was gone. The times were poor. People needed an escape, and they needed heroes. The Yankees found Joe McCarthy. Baseball found itself attracting ex-presidents and presidents. Franklin Roosevelt set the example, finding relaxation at a baseball game in a world on the edge of poverty and struggling not to slip over. The Polo Grounds became a meeting place for the famous of eras gone by. And no politician forsook the chance to throw out the first ball. Where could he be assured of such an audience? Carl Hubble, old long pants, gave other teams fits with the screwball. And Casey Stengel just gave them fits. And the Giants had Master Melvin Ott. As a hitter, Ott had few peers, but he had two notorious habits. One of them was lifting that right foot in the air, which the experts said was wrong. The other habit, hitting home runs. Oh, how he could hit them. The Polo Grounds was ringed on the east by Yankee Stadium, on the west by Coogan's Bluff. The north was for home runs. The south was for mellow. Despite the short foul lines, the Polo Grounds had one of the deepest center fields in either league. And that made it a long walk for the pitcher who couldn't finish the game. And all the way, the booze ringing in your ears. 415 feet, 175 measured steps. It's a long walk in any park, but longer yet at the Polo Grounds. Carl Hubble has taken that walk after moments like this, but probably fewer times than any other giant pitcher. Because nobody could control the great sluggers like King Carl Hubble.
I go back to the the All-Star game of 1934. That was the second All-Star game played. I was selected to start the game against the American League that day, and at that time the American League had a pretty good array of sluggers in the lineup. The Polo Grounds, as everyone knows, has very short right and left field fences right down the line. They goes away very abrupt, and by the time you get to left center and right center, it is a long ways to hit a home run, but very short down the lines. The old expression of Chinese home runs were coined there in the Polo Grounds. But anyway, Gabby Hartman was going to be the catcher that day, and he and I went over the hitters before the game, and of course, my best pitch was my screwball, and we decided that probably those hitters had seen a lot better fastballs and curves than I hadn't seen too many screwballs, and that'd be the pitch that we should make them hit. And that's the way we started, that we worked on the hitters. We showed them other pitches, the fastballs and the curve, but did not get it over the plate.
Strike three, Babe Ruth. Strike three, Lou Gehrig. Strike three, Jimmy Fox. Then Al Simmons and Joe Cronin to start the next inning. Cubs' greatest moment, not his greatest game.
Go back just a year before that, we were fighting for the pennant with the Cardinals. They came into the Polo Grounds about the middle of the season. We had a doubleheader schedule. I started the first game against Tex Carlton, and Tex Carlton pitched 16 innings of scoreless baseball against us. Naturally, I had gone along also. He was taken out for a pinch hitter, and Jess Haynes came in. Finally, in the bottom of the 18th inning, we scored a run to win the game 1-0. That was the longest game that I ever pitched, and probably the best for that length of time, because I didn't walk anybody that day, I remember. And I think they got 6 hits in the 18 innings.
The football giants also brought their share of glory to the Polo Grounds in the mid-30s. There was the incredible sneakers game. The winning touchdowns scored by Ken Strong.
This is just about the spot where I took off for the last touchdown against the Chicago Bears in the 1934 championship game. We'd been pushed around pretty good that day in the first half, and I have in my hand here 2 cleats that was the reason for it. You notice this cleat here is filed to a point, but during the first half on the hard ground, this point broke off, and the Bears lost their traction. Steve Owen had sent a fellow up to Manhattan College to get some sneakers, and he came back with them during the halftime, and most of us fellows tried to find sneakers that would fit us. Some of us did. Some of them had them too loose, so they had to have them taped on. 9 of us started the second half with the sneakers. And because of the broken cleats on the Bears' shoes and the sneakers that we were wearing, we got the advantage by getting the traction, and we won the ball game in the last quarter, right here in the Polo Grounds. I'm sorry to see it's going to be torn down.
The Polo Grounds was a place where careers began and ended. Babe Ruth in a Boston Braves uniform. and young Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper, hitting his first World Series home run in the Polo Grounds in 1937. Baseball was on top, and everybody who was anybody came to the Polo Grounds, the great and those destined for greatness. Congressman Lyndon B. Johnson. Mel Ott was still pumping his right leg and pumping baseballs into right field. And dapper Bill Terry reflected the Giants' prosperity. In football, too, the Giants had titles to win and to defend. In 1938, it was the Green Bay Packers who came to town to battle a hardy breed tutored by Coach Steve Owen. The Packers had players like Arnie Herbert, Don Hudson, and Carl Molino. The Giants countered with Tuffy Lehmans. And Ed Danowski. Touchdown. The Giants won in the seesaw contest, and the Polo Grounds added another title to its history. It was also the heyday of college football. This is Pittsburgh against Fordham. The Polo Grounds got some of the great college games. You won't see any scoring here. Pittsburgh met the Fordham Rams 3 years in a row. And every game was a tie, nothing to nothing. They punted a lot in those days. There was always a bit of humor at the Polo Grounds, even before the Mets got there. Mr. Pepper Martin and some of his colleagues from the St. Louis Cardinals contributed their share. Now, you thought this act was only played on a basketball court. Well, the first game of Who's Got the Baseball and Who's Gonna Get It was played by Pepper Martin and members of the Gas House Gang from St. Louis. For the adolescents, that's Pepper Martin, second from the left, and on his left, Frenchie Bordigaray. Not all the fighting at the Polo Grounds was being done by teams. In June 1941, Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, scored one of his most dramatic victories against Flashy Billy Kahn. This is the 13th round. Kahn, unmarked and seemingly unbeatable, was far ahead on points. An upset appeared imminent to everybody, except Louis. Once down, Kahn couldn't beat the count. It was a quiet December Sunday afternoon, the football Giants versus the football Dodgers. New York Times sports columnist Arthur Daly tells the story.
I was handling the public address at that time, and the game between the Giants and the Dodgers was moving along briskly when all of a sudden one of the telegraph operators, after frantic clicking of his instrument, suddenly said, "Heavens," he said, "the Japs have just bombed Pearl Harbor." But then there was hesitancy on my part whether I should say anything and interfere with a sports contest in which so many people were deeply engrossed. And then a message came to me, and that was the first of three. And I announced it over the loudspeaker system. will Colonel William J. Donovan please call his office in Washington immediately? And then was one that came a little later on a somewhat lighter note, was would Max Annenberg, chauffeur, please report? And by this time, the game was moving, in fact, racing toward an end. And then just as the crowd started to filter from the field, a message was delivered to me, and I was asked to announce, will all members of the armed services report to their unit headquarters? And all that time I wondered, should I announce the bombing or should I not? And there was no one there to help me. I still don't know whether I did the right thing or not, but I did not announce that war was on its way.
The Polo Grounds' contribution to World War II was an open door. Its motto, any sport for any worthwhile charity or benefit. Tennis star Alice Marble joined 3 men in a game to raise money for the war effort. Miss Marble's partners, Don Budge, John O'Grady, and Carol Cosell. Every sport got a chance in the Polo Grounds, except, of course, polo. The winner, Greg Rice. Among the track favorites was pole vaulter Connie Warmerdam. He was the world's first 15-foot pole vaulter. When he wasn't assigned to an Army base overseas, Joe Louis gave exhibitions that filled the Polo Grounds. With Bob Feller and Gene Tunney on hand. For comedy relief, there was Al Schacht on third, and dancing singing star Ray Bolger on third and second. Throw the ball, Ray. The Polo Grounds was a place to meet your heroes. General Dwight Eisenhower. Our Army was winning abroad and at home. West Point had Mr. Outside, Glenn Davis. And Mr. Inside, Doc Blanchard. Here he is, pulverizing the Duke University line in 1945. Sid Luckman was pitching touchdowns for the Chicago Bears. Owned then, as now, by Papa Bear George Hallis. In one afternoon at the Polo Grounds, Luckman threw 7 touchdown passes, a record. And when he couldn't find a receiver open, he ran the ball over himself. And don't ever forget number 33 of the Washington Redskins, Sammy Baugh. This was a black day in the 40s for many Giant fans. Dodger manager Leo DeRocher had become Giant manager Leo DeRocher. He wasn't sentimental about it.
He managed the Giants after managing Brooklyn for several years. Well, to me, it was just going to another ball club. It was a job. I was fired from the Brooklyn job and accepted the one with the Giants.
Leo always had important people around him. But the one he wanted most was the one he got in 1951, Willie Mays. And in 1954, Cleveland's Vic Wirtz hit one and Willie made the catch. look at that throw.
The catch that I made off of Vic wasn't a real difficult catch, but like I said, it was in the World Series, and a lot of people said it was, so who am I to argue about it? And it was a $11,000 catch, and then again, they said, describe it as a way that they want to use it, so I didn't say anything about it, but I thought that the catch wasn't the hardest, but I thought the throw was the one that was really the play on that, and no one even mentioned that too much about it.
Leo could get lucky with a ball player. Same year, same game. Dusty Rhodes. And there goes Willie. For the Polo Grounds, the 50s had opened on a tragic note. Death struck from atop Coogan's Bluff. From the roof of an apartment building where a boy only 14 fired a pistol skywards. The bullet found a mark in section 43, seat 3. The man in that seat, Bernard Lawrence Doyle, slumped forward, dead. The kid said he was sorry. October 3rd, 1951. This is the spot. 3:52 p.m. Newcomb leaves. Branca arrives. Dodgers lead 4-2, bottom of the ninth. Bobby Thompson is up. .358 p.m. It is over. All over. The Giants win the pennant.
It's kind of sad in a way to look around here at the old Polo Grounds clubhouse amid all the rubble and the mess, and to think that in a short while they're going to tear it down and it'll be all forgotten about. And 13 years seems an awfully long time, but I can still remember we were all very excited as we came walking up these steps here through the door, and I myself, I was almost nauseous. It seems I didn't realize how excited I was, because when I walked over there at that door to walk down to my locker, the first thing I saw was a table full of the champagne and all the things that pennant winners enjoy. I don't think they were expecting us to win the pennant, because there were no photographers. I understand all the lights and cameras were over at the Dodger dressing room. And anyway, all I thought about when I looked in this room and I saw this table full of champagne there was that, oh boy, I don't need any of that. It just made me sick to think about it, and all I wanted to do was sit down and relax and rest. But of course that was impossible. The room was filled up so quickly, and it was like Grand Central Station, actually. And about 15 minutes later, a huge, tremendous throng of fans were outside these windows here, and all clamoring to give the Giant ball players one more wave of congratulations. And Leo DeRocher hollered for me to come on out, and he and I, of course, with happy smiles on our faces and with arms around each other, walked out here on the platform, and we waved to the many thousands of people out there, and I must say it was a very happy Giant crowd out there.
I can remember sitting in that position after all the tumult had died down, and I knew Barney Stein was taking the pictures, and I knew they would be uncomplimentary, but I just didn't care at that time. And actually, I don't remember walking from the mound to the clubhouse. I remember a lot of reporters in here asking questions. I don't ever remember sitting by my locker, and I remember sitting on these steps and wondering, why did it have to be me? And as far as getting dressed and taking a shower, I don't really remember much about it. I remember taking a shower and getting dressed, and it probably took me about an hour after the game had been over. I remember walking to the parking lot, and of course in the old days we walked across the field and out through a special player's entrance. And when I got to the car, Ann, who was then my fiancée, was in the car with her cousin, her father, Frank Rowley, Dean of Discipline at Fordham University. And of course, she started to cry a little when I got in the car, and I told her not to worry, I was fine, but why did it have to be me? Out of all the ball players on the club, I was a guy who lived cleanly. I was always in shape. I did as much running as anybody outside of Big Don Newcomb, who worked like a real mule. And I loved baseball, and I gave it 105%. And why did it have to be me? And Father Rowley, who we call Father Pat, looked at me and said, God chose you because he knew your faith would be strong enough to bear this cross. And from that time on, I would say 1 hour after the game, it was easy for me because I just took it as a cross and I was able to bear it.
For 41 years, Yankee Stadium has been only a bridge away from the Polo Grounds. And oddly, the Polo Grounds is where a lot of Yankee history has been written. The last chapter was the last home run of Joe DiMaggio's career in the 1951 World Series. The final tipping of the cap by the fabulous Yankee. This old dugout, its concrete floor covered with rainwater, its planking rotten, still lives with a superstition. That John J. McGraw sat only on this backs at the end of the dugout.
Traditionally, as far as I know, it was put there by Mr. McGraw so that he could be raised higher in the dugout and see the playing field much better. I was hoping that by sitting on the box, which was left there throughout the years, I know that the late Mel Ott had it there and used it, and I sat on it. I was hoping that some of Mr. McGraw's ability would rub off on me.
The Giants rubbed off Leo in 1955. That same year was the last for the football Giants in the Polo Grounds. Just when they were building a great team for any day, any weather. This is the famous mud game against the Chicago Cardinals in 1955. Mud or no mud, Charlie Connolly could throw to Alex Webster. Webster could move the football. This was the era of Otto Graham, the practically perfect quarterback. His passing artistry kept the Giants out of many championships and put Cleveland in. It was also still the era of the big fight. And here is Sugar Ray Robinson, literally destroying Randy Turpin on September 12, 1951. This was the Robinson whom so many remember, perhaps the best ever pound for pound. And in 1953, Rocky Marciano, in his fighting prime, demolished Roland Costaza. Costaza tried to stay alive, but couldn't. This is our last season in New York. Just like that. Giants owner Horace Stoneham told the press in 1957. Wipe out 70 years. Just like that. The fans wouldn't buy it. They came out to the Giants' last game, begged, pleaded. took more than their memories home, but no soap. The Giants left. The sports future of the Polo Grounds was all downhill from then on. Sure, New York's Cardinal Spellman packed the place Loyalty Day. Soccer had some popularity, but nothing like when old Carlisle Indian Jim Thorpe appeared for a different kind of kicking exhibition a few years earlier. They even tried the spills and thrills of midget car racing. Boxing brought the place to life. In June 1960, Floyd Patterson was rematched with Sweden's Ingemar Johansson. For Patterson, it was a chance to regain the heavyweight title, something that had never been done before.
I just wanted to get inside. I don't think I can find words to express how I felt at that moment, except somewhat similar to the way I did in 1952 when I won the Olympics.
The time, 1 minute, 51 seconds of the fifth round, and the first man ever to regain the heavyweight championship, the winner, Floyd Patterson.
And then in 1962, baseball was back at the Polo Grounds. The National League had expanded, and the dear young Mets made the old Polo Grounds their home. So once again, the crowds were flocking out of the subways and into the Polo Grounds.
Guaranteed to have the time of your life because the Mets are really something to fall.
The one and only Casey Stengel serenaded everyone with musical praise of his amazing Mets. Fans came out to see their old heroes, Duke Snyder and Gil Hodges. These new Polo Ground rooters were a rare breed, so they became known as the new breed. Win or lose, it didn't matter to the new breed. They just loved the Mets. It was said of the new breed that they swooned at the drop of a bunt and even enjoyed strikeouts. The second honeymoon lasted 2 years. The last season, Casey Stengel walked off the Polo Grounds diamond for good. The Mets were turning their backs on Manhattan, moving across 2 rivers to the borough of Queens, site of a new and modern ballpark, Shea Stadium. It was a sad move, even for Bill Shea.
City fathers have done me a great honor in naming the new stadium for me, but the coming down of the Polo Grounds is something that cannot be replaced. The tradition, the character of the Polo Grounds has been built through great triumphs and utter despair. It will take years at the new stadium for us to acquire this accomplishment, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do it in a hurry to get back to have something to replace the Polo Grounds.
One wonders, will there be a plaque put here to mark the Polo Grounds? Even without baseball, the Polo Grounds had a few breaths left. The New York Jets ran their last play as the clock read 4:35, December 14, 1963. Fitting, perhaps, that the last sports play there was a line bump for no gain. The Polo Grounds has been a loser for nearly 10 years, and it looks it now. Maybe when the baseball giants left it, they took more than a baseball team. If an arena can be said to have a soul, the Giants took it with them.
Oh, it's a pretty lonely place here now. There's nobody here but me, the cats, the pigeons. They own the place now. like the Mets, I guess I'll have to find a new place too eventually. I guess the Cats pitching have to find themselves one too. They don't have no place to go. I can find somewhere. It's a shame to see this place tear down, really. Walking around, it gives you a real eerie feeling. It's nothing like it used to be years ago when I used to come here as a kid. It's a real lonely place in here, real lonely.
We've relived a lot of excitement. The thrills were here. But that's all past. So is the Polo Grounds. There'll be no reprieve this time. The Polo Grounds is dead.